Take a break. Hey, everybody. Happy Monday night to you. I've got a new lecture, new assignment for you for Jesus in the New Testament. Several of you mentioned that you knew a little bit about the parables, but not a lot. And so for today and then again on Thursday, I'm going to center on some specifics. We mentioned in the last lecture that there's a couple of kinds of parables that we want to look at. One is general, just to the while he was talking to the larger group, and then the more specific, caustic kinds of parables that he told about the scribes and the Pharisees and the Jewish leadership. And so we're going to be talking about those today and Thursday. I'm working on a way to get that second test taken care of for you so you can update your grades and we can be more online with where we actually are in the semester. We're going to finish this third section before long and be in the home stretch. So I'm sorry we're behind, but just couldn't be avoided. All right. So let me pop up my notes here. And we're going to be talking about parables, particularly concerning the kingdom. These are general parables that have to do with the coming of the kingdom of heaven. So I'm going to be reading several of them to you and then just commenting on the things that Jesus was trying to get across in these parables. The first one is found in Matthew chapter 9, verses 16 and 17. And this one is really I don't know, an eye opener, I guess, for the disciples. It told them a little bit more about the changes that were taking place and who Jesus was including in these changes, and perhaps whom Jesus was not including in these changes. So Matthew 9, 16 and 17 says, "No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. The patch will pull away from the garment and make the tear worse. Neither do people pour new wine into old wineskins. If they do, the skins will burst, the wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined." A modern metaphor for this: you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Jesus specifically did not go to Jerusalem and try to evangelize the leadership at Jerusalem. One of the reasons that they were so put out with him, one of the reasons that they rejected him so quickly, was that he wasn't one of them. He didn't come up through the Jerusalem school system. He didn't go to the rabbi schools. He didn't learn from the teachers that were the most respected there in Jerusalem. He shows up from Nazareth. He's a nobody. He's an unknown. And he draws to himself a group of unknowns, fishermen and tax collectors, and we'll even have one that was a Sicarii. A Sicarii was someone who had sworn his life against the Roman Empire, so an insurrectionist, so borderline criminal in that case. And Jesus says to his disciples, "You don't sew a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, and you don't put new wine into old wineskins." Both of these parables mean basically the same thing, and that is that people who have already made up their minds, people who have long since decided that they understand God's will and what He wants and how He wants it, and they've become solid in their pursuit of those things, are very difficult to reteach. Right? So Jesus brings to himself a bunch of blank slates. He begins to teach them the things that he wants them to know. Uh, I'll explain it just in case you're not familiar with the idea of unshrunk cloth. If you have a pair of jeans that is 100% cotton, they don't sell those a whole lot anymore. But if you buy a pair of 100% cotton jeans, you have to be careful when you throw them in the dryer because that first time around, they're going to shrink up pretty considerably. Right. So imagine that if you have a hole in your jeans and you didn't pay $50 extra to have somebody put a hole in your jeans before you bought them. Never have figured that out. But if you have a pair of jeans, you have a hole in them, you can't take a new piece of cotton fabric and sew that on there because as soon as you throw it in the dryer, your jeans may have drawn up the first time. They may have already shrunk up to whatever size they're going to be. That piece of cloth has not. So when you throw it in the dryer, then that piece of cloth is going to shrink and it's going to separate and it's going to make the tear worse than it was to begin with. And the same thing is true kind of in the opposite direction for wineskins. In those days, they would take sheep's bladders, goat's bladders, um, pieces of leather that they would sew together and seal so that they could put wine into them. Well, they would put the wine in when it was unfermented, right? The new wine, they would call it. So there's not much sugar content, there's not much alcohol content in the beginning. But as it stays inside that bladder, inside that piece of leather for a while, it begins to give off carbon dioxide. It begins to ferment, and as it is fermenting, it expands the container. Right. So as long as it's a new container and new wine, they kind of expand together, and everything's fine. The problem is if you take one that's already been expanded to its greatest extent and you put new wine into it, and the new wine begins to bubble up, so to speak, and begins to expand, it can't hold the pressure, and so it blows up the bladder, it blows up the leather pouch, and everything that you had in there is lost. So Jesus says, I'm not about to waste all of my teaching on containers that can't hold it. I'm not about to waste all of my teaching on trying to fix what's wrong with those who already think they've got everything right. So you can't teach an old dog new tricks. You don't sew new cloth on an old garment, and you don't put new wine into old wineskins. The next parables are in Matthew 13, and these are some of the most well known. You've probably heard at least one of them, maybe more of them, uh, during the course of your life, going to Bible class or whatever. Let me get over there to them. All right. A couple that are fairly similar to what we were just talking about, but a little bit different. The parable of the mustard seed and the yeast. In other words, things that are very small, but they expand. Right? So there's going to be small beginnings in the kingdom of heaven, but eventually it's going to fill up the earth. Just think about 2,000 years ago, uh, the entirety of this movement would fit in a room. Right? In fact, there were days during the ministry of Jesus that you could have had 10 people or less and they could have kept social distance from each other. Because in the very beginning, it was just Jesus and a very few disciples that he was calling to himself and beginning to teach about the kingdom of heaven. So here are two explanations, two metaphors about that. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. Though it is the smallest of all seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree, so that even the birds can come and perch in its branches. Uh, you've probably never run across a mustard plant that you knew of, but when I was about 7 years old, my mother bought me a little tie clasp to wear to church. And it had a little amber uh, bubble on the tie clasp, and inside there was a mustard seed. It basically looked like a small fleck of pepper. Like if you spill a pepper shaker onto the table, that one little bitty fleck, that's about how big the seed is. But the tree itself grows to a pretty good size. So it's large enough that the birds could even come and nest in it. So in the beginning, the kingdom of heaven was going to be like a mustard seed. It was just Jesus and a few. But 2,000 years later, it is the largest uh, religion on the planet. A little over two have in common that we name the name of Christ. Right? He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into about 60 pounds of flour until it all worked through the dough. Right? 60 pounds of flour, a lot of flour, but it only takes a little bit of yeast to make that uh, chemical reaction so that the bread rises. Right? So, uh, hopefully, You've had somebody make you fresh homemade bread. You haven't gone your whole life eating white bread out of Walmart, but there's always a chance that somebody has missed out. If that's true, you need to let me know, because I know people that can help you with that problem and get you some fresh uh, homemade bread that has the yeast in it. All right. So again, the kingdom of heaven was going to begin very small, but it was going to grow throughout the years. And while they were in the vast minority in their generation, then later on, the things that they were doing were really going to make a big difference. And that's even true in the modern era to some degree. There are people who go and do ministry in places where there hasn't been a church before. And in the beginning, there may only be, themselves and their families. There may only be a handful of people that are meeting together in that place. But as time goes by, maybe even after they're dead and gone, that congregation will continue to grow and perhaps could be even thousands of people uh, because they did the work, because they put the effort to go out and to get the thing started. All right. We're going to go to Matthew 13:44. Again, some more discussions of what the kingdom of heaven is like. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure that's hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy, he went and sold everything that he had and bought that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. When he found one of great value, he went away and sold everything that he had and bought that pearl. I have to tell you that I have a sticking point in these two parables, because what we have is a person who is going along his way, doing his thing, and he finds a treasure, and so he hides the treasure again, and he goes out and he buys that property. But think about it in these terms. Let's say that you're prospecting for gold, and you find a place that has good gold, and you think you can make a fortune from that place. Well, you go and you stake a claim, and you pay the fees, and you do whatever you have to do to have that piece of property as your piece of property. Maybe you're going along the highway one day and you see a car in a garage on the side of the road, and you know automobiles, and you realize that that particular automobile is worth hundreds of thousands of dollars if it's restored correctly. So you sell off whatever else you've got, and you go and you buy that automobile, and you bring it home and you fix it, because you realize that if you give up every card that you've ever had, you can get that one card, and that one card is worth more than all your other cards put together. So the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure. It's like a precious pearl that you just trade in everything else. Right? So it's very small, but it's going to grow large someday. And if people could see the worth in it, if they could realize how important the kingdom of heaven really was, then they would give up whatever it was they had to give up to inherit that kingdom. Beginning in verse 47 of Matthew 13. Once again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was let down into the lake, and it caught all kinds of fish. When it was full, the fishermen pulled it into the shore. They sat down and collected the good fish into baskets, but they threw the bad fish away. This is how it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come and separate the wicked from the righteous and throw them into the blazing furnace, and there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, here's the flip side. I believe what Jesus is saying is that all of the fish in the net belong to the fishermen. In other words, the kingdom is going to permeate the earth, and everyone everywhere will be under subjection to the kingdom, whether they think they are or not. So at the end of the age, in other words, judgment time, he will be uh, coming back and checking out who really embraced the kingdom and who did not. And those who embraced the kingdom are given a special place, and those who did not embrace the kingdom are cast away. And in here it says, thrown into the blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And then verse 51, Jesus says, do you understand these things? So we get kind of a pop quiz for the disciples. I'm telling you all kinds of important things. He spent most of what we call Matthew 13 telling them important things about the kingdom. He says, well, do you understand what I'm telling you? And they said, yes, we understand. So we don't have another interpretation like we did with the parable of the sower or the parable of the weeds. We have Jesus saying, do you get it? And they say, yeah, we think we get it. And so he leaves it. But he does tell them this: every teacher of the law who has become a disciple in the kingdom, who understand the old law, who understand the Old Testament, who will buy into the new part of the kingdom that Jesus is bringing. And not only will they have all of that good stuff from the old law, but they'll have all of this wonderful stuff from the new law as well. So they'll be really rounded, right? Now, the scribes and the Pharisees were going to reject the new stuff, right? You couldn't put new wine into old wineskins. You couldn't put a new cloth onto an old garment. They didn't see the worth of the kingdom of heaven, right? They weren't willing to give up everything they had to buy into the new. They were so tied to what they already had. They thought that their way and their law, the law of Moses, was far more important than the kingdom that Jesus was preaching. So they weren't going to trade. They weren't going to uh, be part of it. And so Jesus says, these are the kinds of guys who are going to be cast out because they couldn't become useful to the fishermen. They couldn't become the thing, the kind of people that the fishermen were looking for. And so nothing is left except for them to be cast out. All right. Now, probably my favorite trio of general parables is found in Luke 15. And if you haven't read these, again, these are some that I bet you have heard before, but I'm going to take a few minutes. You've got all of them, and this will take a few minutes. So get comfortable and let's go through them. This is Luke 15. We're going to start in verse 4. The thing that all of these parables have in common is that something gets lost and then it gets found. Right? So, and once the thing gets found, there is a celebration, right? So the three components are: it's lost, we search for it and find it, we celebrate. Right. So just keep that in mind as we go through. Okay. He says, suppose one of you has 100 sheep and he loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. He calls his friends and neighbors together and says, rejoice with me, I have found my lost sheep. I tell you, in the same way, there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent. Again, you're talking about scribes and Pharisees who considered themselves so righteous that they had no need of repentance. One of you mentioned the other day in one of your responses, Romans chapter 3, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So we're all in the same boat. None of us is completely righteous. None of us can save ourselves. But here is a shepherd who loves his sheep so much that he's not willing to give up any of them. Right? He's got 100. He looks around, he makes his evening count, and he can only count 99. And I wonder how easy it is to count 99 sheep. But anyway, he counts and comes up with 99 and realizes that that one sheep is lost. Well, a sheep by itself out in the wild is in great danger. So the shepherd wants to make sure that the sheep is okay. Jesus describes himself by saying, I came to seek and to save the ones that are lost. Right? So that's his marching orders. That's how he saw himself as a Messiah. So surely, if one of us is missing, he's going to go and search for us. But notice the worth that is placed on the single sheep. When he finds the sheep, he carries it home and announces to all of his friends that he has found his sheep and wants to celebrate the finding of the sheep. So it's not just, an agricultural thing. I had one lost, but I found him in the back 40 and he's back with the herd now. It's a much more personal, much more um, exciting thing for the shepherd that the sheep was lost and then was found, right? The second one shifts to a woman who is married and loses part of her wedding gift. Okay? Suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one of them. Doesn't she light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? And when she finds it, she calls her friends and neighbors together and says, "Rejoice with me, I have found my lost coin." In the same way, I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. Now, we're not talking about just a stack of dimes, right? This is not a woman who had 10 silver coins that she had collected and they were just in a little stack somewhere and she loses one. We're talking about a woman who has lost part of what would be somewhat equivalent to her wedding ring. Okay. There would, like a little doily, a uh, head covering of some kind, and these little silver coins would have been sewn into it, right? So she would have 10 silver coins that were a blessing on her head from her husband or from her husband's family, right? So she wears this thing on her head as a sign of her connectedness, a sign one of those silver coins is gone. So it would be more like if your boyfriend, your fiance gives you your engagement ring, and you wake up one morning and the ring is there, but the diamond is not. My wife and I celebrate our marriage. We've been married 36 years now. We celebrate our marriage a lot of times with rings. And she's not a gold person. She likes silver more than she likes gold, but she likes the uh, the stones. And so about 5 years into our marriage, I bought her an amethyst ring that both of us really, I don't remember where we found it. It may have been a Walmart, but it's absolutely beautiful. She wore it for several years. Well, maybe 8, 10 years ago, all of a sudden that thing was gone. And we looked everywhere. I mean, we looked in the car and in the house and at the office and just anywhere we thought it could possibly have been. We looked in all of her purses and just could not come up with it. It was, I think, 2 years maybe that the thing was missing. And one day she went back to an old container of yarn that she uses. She crochets and knits and does all those things. And sure enough, she was digging through that for some yarn and came up with that ring. And it really was. I mean, it wasn't just a, oh, well, that's nice. We found it kind of thing. I mean, we were celebrating. And it's not an extremely expensive ring, but it has a great deal of meaning. Right. So here's this poor woman, and she has 9 out of 10 coins. Well, that's pretty good, right? You've got 9 coins, but the missing coin was so important to her that she turns the house upside down. She sweeps everything out until she finds that coin. And when she finds it, she calls her neighbors and says, "Hey, we need to celebrate. I lost something very important to me, and now I found it again." Right. So here's the one that you've probably heard. We typically call it the story of the prodigal son. Right? Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had, set off for a distant country, and there he squandered his wealth in wild living. After he spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of the country who sent him into his field to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, he was around him and he kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to the servants, Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. This son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and now he's found. And so they began to celebrate. Uh, the difference in this one is that the thing that is lost is not an inanimate object, right? It is a somebody. It's a thinking thing. And so this poor young man, uh, he didn't have a lot to look forward to in life because he wasn't the oldest. His older brother, whom we'll meet in just a minute, was going to inherit the family holdings. He would get a double portion. He would get twice as much as everybody else, and he would be in charge. So as long as the younger brother lived in that house, he would always be subject to somebody else. So I guess he kind of panicked. He decided he wanted to be his own boss, and he asked his dad for the part of the inheritance that would be his. And so even before the father passed away, he gave the son all the things that were going to belong to him in the future. And the son went out and spent all of his money in what the old King James says is riotous living. The older brother describes it as prostitutes. So he went out and just partied all of his money away until he was so broke that he took a job feeding pigs. Now remember, this is a Jew. Jesus is telling Jewish people this story. The story is about a Jewish family. He's telling it to Jewish people, and he says the boy went in to demote you farther from the faith than A, working for a Gentile, and B, working for a Gentile feeding pigs, and C, wanting to eat the food that they were feeding to the pigs, but nobody gave him anything. So he makes a rational decision, right? My father's servants have food, right? I don't have to be his son anymore. I'm not worthy of that. I blew that assignment. But if I just go back, maybe he'll hire me. Maybe I could just be one of the hired hands and I'll get to eat and I'll have a place to sleep and I won't have to be out here with the pigs. So he makes a rational decision. But God is not in the rational business, right? God's love sometimes is irrational. So as the son is coming home, the father runs out to meet him and immediately begins to celebrate. He doesn't chastise him, he doesn't put him down, he doesn't punish him. He simply says, I was so afraid that you were dead, you were gone, you were lost to me, and now you're back. Let's celebrate. And we don't know what happened the next day. We don't know what kind of discussions or conversations they might have had about the time that he was gone or lessons that he had learned or any of those things. What we know is that the father was so excited about this son coming home that he stopped everything and everybody to celebrate his son coming home. Now, we shift our attention to the older brother, right? We understand who the son is, right? He's somebody that was in sin, who realized that where he was not where he needed to be. That's a good definition of repentance, by the way. We realize that where we are is not nearly so good as where we could be, and so we turn toward the good, turn away from the bad. We know who he is. The Father has to be God, right? God comes to meet the sinner. The angels are the servants. They're celebrating the return of the sinner to the Father. But then there's the older brother. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him, but he answered his father, Look, all these years I've been slaving for you, and I've never disobeyed your orders. But you never gave me a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. When this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fatted calf for him. My son, the father said, You are always with me. Everything I have belongs to you. But we had to celebrate and be glad. This brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and now he's found. Right? This is a transitional parable. Right? Before this, we've been talking mainly about what is the kingdom, what is it like, what kind of people is Jesus seeking for the kingdom, what will it be like when these people find the kingdom and celebrate the kingdom. Uh, Even in talking about the lost lamb and the lost coin, we're just talking about God dealing with the sinner themselves. But the the twist in the prodigal son is that there's an older brother. Now, the older brother probably represents the scribes and the Pharisees, right? The ones who are so full of themselves that they can't find any joy in the salvation of others. They only want you to notice their righteousness. They don't want to celebrate a righteousness that comes by God forgiving these sinners. Right? So, as Jesus goes on in his ministry, more and more, he's going to be talking against the Jewish leadership and the scribes and the Pharisees. Notice there's not a sense of that they were bad people or that they were wrong people. Right? They worked hard at their righteousness. They wanted to do what God wanted them to do. Their problem wasn't how they lived, their problem was why they lived that way. It was about them. It wasn't about the Father. It was about their righteousness. It wasn't about God's righteousness. And Jesus is telling stories about God and stories about the kingdom that are centered on God. What's God's righteousness look like? Well, it looks like a father who loves his son so much that after years of him being gone and after him squandering so much family money on prostitutes and partying, that he throws wide his arms and hugs him and puts new clothes on him and new shoes on his feet, and he throws a party because he loves him that much. The scribes and the Pharisees needed to learn that. They needed to understand that. Flip back to when Peter asked the question, how many times can my brother sin against me and I still forgive him? Should I forgive him 7 times? And Jesus says, no. How about 70 times 7? Or how about 7 times 7? How about stop keeping score? How about forgive because you love your brother and you want your brother to live in a place of forgiveness? So, this imagined response from the older brother kind of sets the stage for Jesus talking more and more about the problems of the Jewish leadership and the kinds of parables that he tells concerning them will start showing us uh, more of their problems, and he'll accentuate those kind of problems in the next few parables that we look at. So, Lord willing, on Thursday we'll talk about some of those parables that are aimed at the Jewish leadership, and if we have time, we'll look at a group of metaphors in the Gospel of John. We talked about John's perfect 7 miracles. We need to take may take a whole day out to talk about John's not so perfect 7 I am. Jesus uses metaphors all through his ministry to describe who he is. I'm the bread of life. I'm the light of the world. I'm the good shepherd. I am, all these I am statements. I am the way, the truth, and the life. So hopefully, if we have time on Thursday, uh, that's all I have for today. If you will, go and check in, make sure you tell me that you've watched the whole thing. If you do not say, I watched the whole video, I kind of assume that you didn't. Uh, you earn the right to respond by watching to the end of the video. So here's your secret word of the day, kids. Coco. If you say, I watched to the end of the video, Coco, I'll know you're telling the truth. Now, just tell me that you watched to the end. Give me some comments about what sticks out in your mind about the general parables that Jesus told, and I'll post something else for you on Wednesday or Thursday. Have a great day. Be safe.